Hello, class, and welcome back to week 2. We are in CJC 160, the terrorism class. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about violence, the history of violence, the definition of violence, things like that, and how violence applies to terrorism. So violence has three elements of the individual decision, and that's what violence is. It's an individual decision. It's not necessarily a group decision, although there can be group violence. Each individual member of that group has to make an individual decision. So that's why we call it just that, an individual decision. So the three elements of violence are as follows. There's a formation of the intent, the execution, and the immediate consequences. Let's talk about the formation of the intent. That's, you can't, violence by definition can't be an accident. It doesn't mean that if you commit a criminal act by accident, that there is not any consequence, because there can be violations of the law that are not intentional. Also, it doesn't mean that there's no civil liability, because you can still be sued in an accident. It just means that things that are done accidentally cannot be, by definition, an act of violence. They can still be against the law. But that's easy enough if the intentional act goes exactly according to plan. So if you intend to shoot somebody and then you shoot somebody, then that's easy. It's an act of violence. But what if your intentions don't go exactly according to plan? What if you mean to punch somebody, you miss, and you end up punching somebody else? Is that still an act of violence? You didn't mean to punch that second person. You meant to punch the first person. Yes, under the law and under the definitions, that's called transferred intent. There was still the intent to commit violence, and the violence was followed through upon. So according to transferred intent and that doctrine, you can still commit an act of violence against a person you weren't meaning to commit against. Execution is just doing it. It's the Nike motto, just do it. That execution is the follow through of the intent. And then to finally have the triumvirate of the definition, the immediate consequences have to follow. Now, the definition of immediate is up for debate. In a terrorist act or an act of violence, there are almost always going to be consequences to that violent act, and how quick those consequences can be deemed immediate is up to interpretation and up to how the perpetrator or the victim sees it. So with those three, the formation of the intent, the execution, and the immediate consequences, we have the full definition of violence. But let's see how violence turned to terrorism historically. Let's look at way back, some of the earliest forms of violence that were individualized and could be deemed possibly acts of terror were assassinations. And if we look at assassinations and we follow that definition that we talked about last week of what exactly is terrorism, let's plug an assassination of a political figure, a president, a king, something like that, a member of the monarchy. Let's plug that act of violence into the terrorism definition that we talked about last week. So what we said was, for a violent act to be an act of terror, it has to be politically motivated, it has to be violent, or there has to be threats of violence. The action has to have far-reaching repercussions. So with those three things, let's plug assassination to it. So Julius Caesar was used in the book. So Julius Caesar was assassinated on March 15th of 1944. I'm way off there. March 15th of 44 BC. I remember that date. I remember the exact date just because by coincidence, March 15th was my first day with LAPD. So I remember if you ever saw or read the Shakespearean play Julius Caesar, and it has the soothsayer telling Julius Caesar, beware the Ides of March, which is a holiday that always falls on March 15th. It's easy to remember that Julius Caesar was killed on March 15th. But apparently, according to my flub a couple seconds ago, the year is a little harder. It's 44 BC. March 15th, 44 BC. So Julius Caesar was killed in a political overthrow. So it meets that first definition, that first element of the definition of terror acts, which is they have to be politically motivated. They have to be violent or a threat of violence. Well, Julius Caesar was killed by stabbing several times. It doesn't get much more violent than that. There was an intent to stab him. There's the execution of stabbing him, and there were immediate consequences. He died, and there was a political overthrow. And then the far-reaching repercussions that are necessary for a terror act were there in that political overthrow. So you see how violence melds into an act of terror by those elements meeting each other. With that in mind, we have a discussion board post this week, and I'd like you to further this discussion that we've had here in your post. The post is the prompt is to describe how violence becomes terror and its historical roots. We've talked a little bit about it here. You can cite this video. Just make sure that there are at least 2 sources for your citations, which, as a reminder, you need the reference portion as well as the in-text citation portion. So you can either use this video, the textbook, outside resources, but there have to be at least 2 of them. If you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me. If you have any challenges with getting the materials or understanding the materials, once you do get them, please reach out to me so we can take care of any issues and challenges sooner than later. It helps you with such a short class, a 10-week class. We really got to stay on top of our material and not get behind. That being said, I look forward to seeing your posts and interacting with you, and I will talk to you soon.